So a quick note, I have already posted the homework number 5, which is due after the week. So I'm asking you all to solve the problem that are end of chapters from chapter 4. In today's class, we are going to start into next chapter, which is chapter 5, which is based on clustering and classification. So in today's class, we will talk about clustering and classification. So what is clustering? Clustering is we are trying to combine. So clustering is combining similar data sets. And these similar data sets would be like images of dogs or images of cat or different types of flowers. And classification is basically separating these different data sets into different components. So it's like naming. So this is like assigning data sets. Now, when you look at machine learning is based on the optimization of the data sets. So basically what you do is you perform different objective functions, minimizations. So you have objective functions. And then what you do is you use optimization technique and then what you do is the purpose of the optimization is clearly your initial data set is a big dimension. So it could be like 100 by 100 or 1000 by 1000. But clearly out of those 1000 by 1000 data sets, not all the features, not all the elements are important. So what we want to do is we want to actually isolate, we want to find out the most important features. Or the features that distinguish the data, one data set from the other. Now, this is very, very important. So machine learning provides the tools to perform this feature recognition, feature classification in a very systematic form. What it also does, so I need to write this down, machine learning and believe it or not, machine learning starts with regression. And then you have different types of features. And then what you do is you learn based on those features, learn and predict. And again, it's very important to understand that AI or artificial intelligence is closely related to machine learning. In other words, AI is dependent or based on integrated machine learning algorithms. And these algorithms, they are derived from the various techniques in statistical analysis, data analysis, optimization, and so on. So whenever someone talks about the machine learning, there are two types of machine learnings. One is supervised machine learning, and second one is unsupervised machine learning. So now what does it mean when you have a supervised machine learning? So in supervised machine learning, you already know the labels of the data. So you say, for an example, if you have a data set that comprises of cats and dogs, then you have cats and dogs. So that's supervised machine learning. In unsupervised machine learning, what you want is you want machine learning algorithm to work on the images and sort of cluster similar images together. So in supervised machine learning, you have the algorithm that is presented with the data set that is labeled either 0 or 1, cats or dog, so on and so forth. In the unsupervised machine learning, what you do is you actually run the machine learning algorithm and it doesn't know the labels, but it looks at the similarities or it compares the features and finally decides or sort of classifies those machine learning algorithms. Now, again, there are subtypes. One is called as something called as the semi-supervised machine learning. Semi-supervised machine learning. In semi-supervised machine learning, what you have is you don't have the complete training data set. So which means, for an example, if you want to run a supervised machine learning, what you do is you take the data set, you separate out the data set into training data set, validation data set, and then you tweak the algorithm so that when the new data set is presented to the algorithm, the automatic classification occurs. But in the semi-supervised machine learning, the data set is not complete. So you have data set that is missing. So you have missing data set. So you have missing data sets. Also, there is another concept which is called as active learning. So in active learning, what you have is you have, for an example, you have data set. In data set, basically you have labels for the limited set of data set. And what we need to do is we need to tune the algorithm so that it actually optimizes the objects where the data set is labeled and uses that to actively learn about the data set and comes up with some type of an algorithm that can be used for supervised machine learning. Then next thing is you have something called as the reinforcement learning. And in reinforcement learning, what happens is you perform learning, and depending upon whether the algorithm has achieved the desired result, you reward or punish the algorithm. For an example, if you have a task and pertaining to that task, you have a metric that defines the success or the failure. If the algorithm succeeds, then you reward. If the algorithm fails, then you punish. And you perform this reward and punishment cycle iteratively, and that actually leads to refinement. And reinforcement learning has been widely used in lot of techniques and lot of algorithms where this reward punishment type of approach has been used. Now, next thing which I want to talk about is we are going to talk about some interesting supervised and unsupervised learning algorithms. So in this chapter or in this lesson, we are going to talk about, and again, there are many algorithms. So we are going to talk about some most commonly used supervised and unsupervised machine learning techniques. So we are going to look at common, supervised, and unsupervised machine learning techniques. Now, one thing I want to tell you, data science is a very upcoming field, which is very lucrative, and a lot of engineers are getting into data science to understand and learn from data. So if you look at the data, what you want to do is you want to use the data. So you have this data, and that data could be anything. That data could be picture, that data could be figure, that data could be weather, or that data could be of a different at different scales, or it can have different times, and it can have different level of granularity. So some data could be sparse, some data could be dense. So what you need to do is, if you want to use data, or in other words, if you want to exploit data, for diagnostic, prediction, or for that matter, control, you must understand what is that data based on? What are the fundamental components of data? And we looked at earlier when we started talking about data analysis, machine learning, we looked at something called as singular value decomposition. We also looked at principal component analysis. And what these two techniques do is they find out the most dominant correlation. And in case, if you just review the material that we discussed earlier, we looked at the eigenfaces example. So what we did is we had different images, and what we tried to do is we looked at, we came up with some type of flattening of image data, and then we found out that if you have faces, then you will see that the face would have maybe a circular feature. It will have two eyes. It will have a nose. It will have some type of other facial features. So these are the eigenfaces or fundamental components. Or fundamental correlations. And these fundamental correlations are very important because many a times these correlations are not visible to the naked eye. So for an example, if I were to look at the data, I would not understand how certain quantity or certain feature is related to some other feature. For an example, I can't imagine that you can have a face where the eyes are at the bottom of the face. Or if you have, instead of two eyes, you have three eyes. For us, for humans, it can be easily, we can easily distinguish that. But for a computer algorithm needs to understand that if it's a face, then the important feature is it needs to have two eyes, not three, not four, not five. It needs to have only one nose, not two, not three, not four. So what we want to do is all this basically leads to construction of intrinsic means that is embedded in data set, construction of intrinsic low rank feature space. And again, you can use PCA, you can use SVD, you can use whatever, but at the end of the day, we want to find out the low rank feature space. Now, many a times, these features, these low rank features are obvious. So they are obvious. So you can just look at the feature space and find it out. Sometimes you need to perform some type of analysis or some type of process, some different processing, either a correlation, construction, reconstruction, some type of analysis to extract that feature set. Now, what I'm going to do is, now I'm going to switch to MATLAB. And in few MATLAB codes, what I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you different data sets and what are the most important features that make that data set. And what that would tell us is like, how do we identify a data set where features can be easily observed, and what are some type of data sets where the features are not clearly observed. So I'm going to go through series of examples inside MATLAB. And again, these examples are given in the textbook. And what we are going to do is we are going to run through these examples, and then we are going to talk about different algorithms, how these algorithms work, and then finally, how do we use these different features in the data set to perform classification. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and actually I'm going to share my screen. And what we are going to do is we are going to go to MATLAB. We are going to go to MATLAB, and we are going to run the code that is given as this Fisher's data set. So this data set is built inside MATLAB, and I would encourage you to download this code. this code is uploaded onto Canvas and extract this code. And what we will do is we are going to run this data set step by step. So this fisheries data set is given inside the MATLAB. And what I want to do is we want to actually look at 3 different types of the varieties. So for an example, we have 50 measurements of Iris centosa, versicolor, and virginica. And each flower, so these 3 different types of flowers, and each flower comprises of a different sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. So basically what we want to do is we want to look at these 4 distinct characteristics like sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. And then we want to see if based on these 4 features, if we can separate out these different varieties of flowers. So what I would encourage you to do is, I want you to basically either highlight this code and then run this code. So once you run this code, you would notice, and I'm going to just plot 3 features. So on x-axis, you have sepal length. On y-axis, you have petal length, and on sepal width, and on z-axis, you have petal length. And now what I want you to observe is, depending upon these different sizes like sepal length, sepal width, petal length, we clearly have distinct features. So if you want to rotate this figure, you would notice that these different class of flowers are clustered together. And again, it completely depends upon your point of view. So if you have a good point of view, you will notice that the setosa, as shown in the green, is clustered over here. If you look at the versicolor, that is clustered over here. And if you look at the virginica, that is clustered over here. So in this data set, clearly they are clustered. Even though there are 4 features, we are just plotting 3 features because we can't plot 4-dimensional figure in the 3-dimensional workspace. So again, for this particular data set, it's very easy to distinguish. What that means is a numerical algorithm or a computer, once you feed this data set, once you have some type of if else then type of algorithm, the boundaries, the computer algorithm can clearly tell you, yeah, this is setosa, this is versicolor, or this is virginica. Now we are going to go further, and then what we are going to do is we are going to explore the cat and dog data. So what I want you to understand is we have these pictures of dogs and we have pictures of cat. So we have 20 images of dogs and 20 images of cats. So as you can see that there is this cat data and there is this dog data. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that cat and dog data, and then I'm going to cluster it together, which is being done here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract the mean and then perform the singular value decomposition, which is nothing but the principal component analysis. And to make things efficient, I'm going to use economy SVD. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the feature vectors, or the most important features that actually classify these cats and dogs. So what I want you to do is I want you to quickly highlight this code, and I want you to run this code. So once you run this code, I want you to observe that we are looking at the first 4 features, that is, they are generated from the images of cats and dogs. So these are nothing but the first 4 columns of the U matrix of the SVD. And if you were to look at the original images, which is the cats and dogs, you will notice that cats have some features that are very common. So for an example, if you see these pointy ears that you see in these images, they correspond to cat. This circular face, that corresponds to cat. If you look at the dog, then you can see the dog's snout, you can see dog's eyes, and you kind of see the dog's shape. So you can see these different modes for the dogs. Now, again, this is just one way of performing the classification or the features. The second way that we can potentially do it is we can look at how the features are generated for the different types of images. So for an example, you can have a raw image, or you can actually perform the wavelet transform of the image, and then you will see how that works. So for an example, if you look at the next point, if you were to look at the next code, I would encourage you to run this code. You will notice this actually shows you the histogram of this image classification. So this is just one other way of representing the image. You can do the exact same thing for the dogs and cats. Next thing, what you can do is you are welcome to look at the images that are based on the wavelet transformation. So for an example, you have a dog wave, which is performing the wavelet transformation. You have a cat wave, which is performing the wavelet transformation on cat data. So basically, what you can do is you can have a dog wave, you can have a cat wave, and then you can actually perform this wavelet transformation. So I would just take this out. So I would actually highlight this. So now what we have done is we have performed the wavelet transformation. You actually don't have to do this, because if your data set contains cat data w.mat and dog data w.mat, these are the wavelet transformation. So you can just load this, and now you can repeat the exact same procedure on the wavelet of the data set. So you take the image, find in the wavelets decomposition, and run the SVD on the data set wherein you are combining or appending wavelets. So you can actually evaluate this selection. And now, as you can see, one important feature of the wavelet transform is wavelet will emphasize the edges. And now you can clearly see that in this particular image, you don't have those fuzzy features that were present when we did the SVD. Now you see these black and light images or pixels. that actually correspond to the SVD of the wavelet images. And again, depending upon what is your characteristic of the important characteristics of data, whether you have the shape is more important in your data set, or whether the distinguish or image is important, or the difference or contrast is important in your data set, you can use either the actual transform, or you can actually use a wavelet transform, and you can perform the analysis. Now, next thing which I want to talk about, and this is just an interesting observation, is what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually perform a projection of cats and dogs into the feature space that we have constructed. So for an example, what we are doing is we have the data set, and we are projecting the data set, or we are actually looking at the embedding of the data set onto the feature set. And again, these embeddings are actually different. So what I want you to observe is, if you were to look at these figures, you would notice that these figures give you a different type of embedding. Let's run this code, and then you will observe you get these cats and dogs data set. And then what we have done is, if you want to find out the respective embeddings, what you can do is your embeddings would actually look at something like this. So now I want you to observe that what you have is, you have these wavelet images, and these wavelet images embedding is separated for cats and dogs. Now what I want to do is, I want to run the entire code and kind of walk you through this exercise, so everything would be clear. So first thing what I want to show you is, we have these images of dogs, and then we have these images of cat. So we have the images of dogs, and we have these images of cat. And we are performing analysis on these two images. And we have two choices. We can actually look at the image based on just principal component analysis, PCA. And in PCA, as you can see, the edges are not sharp. They are, so basically you get some fuzzy clusters, but you don't get the edges. On the other hand, if you perform the same type of analysis on a wavelet, then all of a sudden you get these sharp features for classification. And then what you can do is, you can also look at the distribution of the images. So for an example, you have these images that are the loadings or the weights for the dogs images, and you have loadings or the weight for the images of cat images. And on the left hand side here, what you have is, you have the raw images, and on the right hand side you have the wavelet images. Now what I want you to observe is, I want you to observe the type of separation this is visible. In raw images, basically you get mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, and mode 4. There is slight separation, but you will notice in the wavelet transformation, you would clearly see that there is a separation between the dog images, and there is a separation between the cat images. You will also observe in the mode 2. So this is mode 1. This is for the raw wavelet. Mode 2 raw, mode 2 wavelet, mode 3 raw, mode 3 wavelet, mode 4 raw, and mode 4 wavelet. So as you can see, in certain aspects, you have a separate distinction, or two parts. The images are separate or away from each other. And in certain parts, you have overlap. So depending upon the data set that you have, what you want to do is you want to use the appropriate types of features and data set. Now, next thing, what I want to do is I want to look at a little bit mathematical analysis or some few key definitions or important insights from the supervised and unsupervised learning. So what I want to do is, so let me share my screen. So what we want to do is, so you can actually look at the distribution of the data. And that data distribution, typically, if you don't know anything about the data distribution, then what you do is you assume that data distribution is Gaussian or normal distribution. So this is typically the distribution of data. So if you have a data that is distributed, then you will notice you got some mean and variance. So mean actually talks about the central tendency, and kind of variance talks about the spread. So you have mean, which is the central tendency, and you have variance, that is spread. And again, mean and variance, they characterize the normal or the Gaussian distribution. So what we want to do is, in the definitions of data science, what we have is, we have this whole data set D, and this data set is inside the R to the power N, which means your data set can have multiple components. It can have a component in X direction, component Y direction, component in Z direction. So you can have a tensor, or you can have a data set or that has multiple levels of features. Now, what you have is you have a subset of data set, and this subset of data set is considered D prime, and this is actually the subset. And what we want to do is, we want to actually use this subset to build a classifier. And the purpose of this classifier is, even though this classifier is built on this subset, it should be able to operate on this big data set D. It should operate on this big data set E. So clearly, how would we write this whole thing mathematically? So mathematically, if I want to define an unsupervised learning problem, so mathematically learning problem, then what it means is you have an input, wherein in input you have the data. This data is certain data given by X that belongs to R to the power N, where you have J that actually is inside the natural sets of numbers, wherein your J is running from 1 to all the way to the M. So what this mathematical notation indicates is, essentially you have a data. So it could be just pictures. And this data set is X1, X2, X3, X4, and now you have all the way to the XM. So these are all the data sets. And then what you have is you have outputs and what you want to do is you want to produce labels where the labels are given as y of j and they could be either plus or minus, wherein j belongs to C. So this is exactly the mathematical framework for unsupervised learning. Now let me rewrite the mathematical framework of unsupervised learning uh, slightly differently. And that actually gives us supervised learning. In supervised learning, what we have is we have input and we have data, where this data is xj r to the power n j. And again, what I'm saying is I'm describing the same data set. So first representation, the input, and you have the data. But in the supervised learning, you are going to specify the labels. So you are assigning the labels from the get-go. So you have y of j's that are belonging to plus, minus. So I'm saying 1 is because I say either it is cats or dogs. So I'm doing sort of the binary classification, whether it's plus 1 or it's minus 1. Now here, my j is in the sets of z prime, which is part of the whole j. So what that means is I have labels, but all the data may or may not be labeled. So for an example, what I have is I have these images, and these images, so this is cat, dog, dog, cat. But then I could have some images that potentially may not be labeled. So I don't know what those images are, or at least, I mean, a human could identify, but the algorithm or the software or a program or the code that you write may not be smart enough to identify whether it's a cat or it's a dog. So at the end, what you want to do is you want to have an output of the algorithm, such as you have label. These yj's are plus minus 1 and j's belong to C. And again, what we want to do is we have the labels for this data set, and this data set, which is the part of the original data set, is missing labels. And we want our algorithm to find and these missing labels automatically. And again, so the way you do it is completely up to you. So for an example, the thing is, you can have a data set. So you can have a data set that can be represented as a supervised learning problem, or it can be represented as an unsupervised learning problem. So for an example, we talked about the different types of flowers. So essentially, I could give a data set. The data set could have features. And what I can do is, based on the principal features, I can actually cluster these data sets together. And it may so happen that these clusters are kind of well separated. So these clusters are kind of well separated. So this is unsupervised learning problem. Or what I can do is, I can again deal with those clusters, but I would have maybe identified that this is the flower of category 1, this is the flower of category 2, and what happens is, as soon as I get a new flower, then the algorithm would either place that in the bin 2, so this is the bin number 2, or it can place in the bin number 1. And again, this because the algorithm is trained so that it can actually look at the different features and actually use that and place that in different types of bins. And this actually is interesting to note, because sometimes you have the characteristics that are linear. For an example, you can have the data set that are the linear characteristics. So for an example, if you have a data set with the linear characteristics, you can have a very clear separation. So you have the data that is clustered together, you can draw a straight line, and clearly you can actually separate out. Sometimes what you have is, you have the data set which is nonlinear. So in nonlinear data set, what you have is, you have the data that is kind of intertwined. So for an example, you can have a data set which is something like this, and you can have another data set which is going something like this. So now your algorithm needs to be smart enough to identify these different data sets, something like this. So you want your algorithm to classify and characterize these two nonlinear data sets or nonlinear boundaries. Another example of the nonlinear data set is, you can have something like this. You have the data set which is clustered at the center, and then you would have a data set which is clustered outside. So clearly, if you want to separate these two out, what you want to do is, you want to do something like this, and this would be the boundary. And these boundaries would actually separate out the data sets. Now, let's look at some simple algorithms, and these algorithms are not new. These algorithms are very widely used for data analysis. So one algorithm I'm going to look at first the unsupervised learning algorithms. So unsupervised learning algorithms. Unsupervised learning algorithms. And in unsupervised learning algorithms, one classic algorithm that is widely known and utilized is called as k-means clustering. Now, what do I mean by k-means clustering? So with the k-mean clustering, so for an example, each classification, so this is if I were to write this algorithm down in words, then what it does, it's basically a partitioning algorithm. So what you do is each data set is actually sort of clustered, or basically the algorithm finds where that data set actually belongs. So each data set, what we do is we find the nearest mean. So we cluster the data set to nearest means, and which serves as sort of the prototype for that cluster. So you can use the prototypes of the, and then what actually happens is once you start doing this clustering, then you actually put those in something called as different types of cells. And these data spaces placing into the cells, which is called as Vero, Voro, Neo cells. And this is how this algorithm actually or works. So step one for the algorithm is basically given initial value, for k different distinct means, compute the distance of each observation that belonging to nearest mean. So belonging to the nearest mean. Then what we do is we label the data set based on where it belongs. So basically, so if you have the k mean, if you have this mean, you have, and then basically you label. So you actually do the label 1, label 2, and you actually label these two data sets. Then what you do is once the labeling is done, what you do is you find the center of mass of the data set. Once labeling is done, find center of mass of the data set. And then what you do is these new means, once you find this center of mass, you can find out the new mean and then use that mean to find the cluster. So once you find, and you iteratively repeat this process. Now, if you believe it or not, this whole thing was developed or proposed in 1957. So this is a very old algorithm, and that is very effectively used for classification, pattern recognition, and unsupervised learning. Now, if somebody really wants to specify this problem in terms of an optimization problem, this optimization problem can be written as argmin, which is the minimum argument of this means, and you are performing the iterations on j is equal to 1 to k, and you have an inner iteration on the data set that belongs to the subset of the universe data set, wherein what we are trying to find out is we are trying to find out iteratively the difference between the data set and the mean of the cluster, trying to find the square root, and this is nothing but actually the L2 norm. This L2 norm is being minimized. And again, mu denotes the mean of the jth cluster and the subset where we are actually trying to classify the cluster. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you some code wherein this algorithm is implemented. So now let's look at MATLAB, and I'm going to share my screen. And what we are going to do is we are going to go to MATLAB. And in MATLAB, I'm going to look at something called as k-means. So, and the way this code is going to work is, let me walk you through this code. What we are going to do is we are going to have basically a training data set, and then we are going to have the real data set, and then we are going to perform this clustering on the data set that is actually used to train the algorithm. And then we are going to look at the different test size. So let's look at this code. So I'm going to have the training data set, which has 100 samples. We are going to have test data sets, which are 50 samples. And then I'm going to construct these different ellipses that are centered. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct these different random ellipses. And then I'm going to partition this data set into test and train. So I will use the train data set to develop the algorithm. And then I will see if that algorithm works on the training data set. So I would encourage you to run this code. And then you will observe that once we run this code, what happens is, I want you to observe that this k-mean clustering using something called as the Lloyd's algorithm actually uses the training data set to identify the clusters, and then you can use that algorithm, the trained algorithm, onto the test data set, and it is able to classify the cluster. So I got this boundary. It's important to note that from k-means clustering, I was able to find out this line that classified majority of the red ellipses with the majority of the blue ellipses. So what has happened is I kind of use this training data set, and this is where it is trained. And then what I did is actually I got this test data, and I put that actually projected or just plotted the test data onto this training or the decision boundary. And now I can clearly see that whatever the decision boundary that we have constructed, that is able to classify the new data set. Now, this is one simple aspect. Now, the other aspect which I want to show you is there are two ways to achieve this k-means clustering. So there is a classic Lloyd's algorithm that we talked about, and there is sort of the more efficient MATLAB's k-means algorithm, which is the improvement on the k-means clustering. So if you look at the Lloyd's algorithm, what you do is you have your initial guesses that are used for labeling the data set. And then as the time goes on, as new data set becomes available, and the algorithm becomes more and more efficient. And it's like at the end, you will notice that the data set converges. And this convergence is shown in these four figures. So for an example, the first figure, you will notice that you have an initial data set, you have these black dots, we are not able to classify them properly. Later, we basically improve the algorithm, it goes through more iterations, you have these black dots. And at the end, once everything is done, you have this two-stage heuristic process that kind of converges after 4 iterations. So if you look at in the last slide or last notes, I showed you 1, 2, 3 steps. So I did the 3 steps. This is the first iteration. 3 steps, again, the second iteration, 3 steps, third iteration, and 3 steps, fourth iteration. And then when I project the new data set, I get a very nice classification. On the other hand, if you just look at the MATLAB k-means command, and in the advantage of this MATLAB's k-means command is you just need to specify the data and the number of clusters. So a priori MATLAB does not know how many, or k-means does not know how many clusters exist. Is there a 1 cluster? Is there 2 clusters? So we have to specify that. And then basically MATLAB would go to the iterative process and then actually construct these clusters. The next part, which actually I want to talk about, is there is an approach which is called as the dendrograms. So dendrograms are the hierarchical structures. And in the hierarchical structures, what we are going to do is we are going to go to the iterations. I will try to explain this in this figure. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find out at the first level, I'm going to perform the iteration 1 and then separate out these 2 clusters broadly. Then I'm going to go a step down further. And then actually I would notice that there are partitions. So I'm gonna separate out these clusters. Then I'm gonna go down one more step deeper, and then I'm gonna separate out the clusters. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna perform this something called as the distance-based classification. And this distance-based classification could be Euclidean distance, square Euclidean distance, Manhattan distance, or Mahalanobis distance. So again, what I want to do is I want to actually give you the theory of it. And then if time permits, I would actually, we will look at the MATLAB code. But here's the idea. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the highest level of granularity, perform the separation, go a step further, perform the separation again, go for the step further, keep on performing separations and see what happens. And at the end, once you perform this dendrogram type of clustering, what you will notice is finally you will have this sort of a tree-like structure. And what it does is basically constructs classification. So the next algorithm, which I want to talk about, and my apologies, the zoom is a little slow here. Okay, so let me once again share. Sometimes if the Zoom servers are overloaded, then this latency is achieved. So you observe this latency. It's not something that we desire, but this is something that we have to deal with. Okay, so in dendrograms, what you have is, this is another algorithm, and this is called as and dendrograms is supervised, or sorry, unsupervised hierarchical clustering. And again, it's like as simple as the word keyword here is hierarchical. So basically you kind of go step down like this. Then kind of go up and down. There are two ways it can be done. One is agglomerative. Wherein what you do is each data point is considered in cluster. So each cluster. And you can have divisive. In divisive, what you have is all observation or all data points. Go to cluster. So you can have agglomerative or you can have divisive. Now, again, what you do is in this process, you perform something called as merging and splitting. And even what we are going to do is in this particular case, first I will look at the agglomerative clustering or dendrogram. So let's look at the approach. So imagine that we have this data set. And first what I'm going to do is I'm going to find out that these 2 points are close together. So I'm going to combine them. In the next iteration, basically these 2 points are now replaced with just one single point. And then I observed that this point is closer to this point compared, so closer to point 1 compared to point 2. So I construct a straight line. And then what I do is I replace these points with their equivalent point. And now I can actually perform the classification between the points that are clustered together and the points that are not clustered together. So now look at, let me explain this once again. So I have a point here, 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 and I have a point here. So what algorithm is going to do is, first it's going to track the points that are closest. Then it's going to replace these 2 points with one point that is at the center. Then it's going to find out the distance from this, and it will observe that this point is very close. So then what it will do is it will find this mean and then observe that this is one cluster. Here same thing is going to happen. It's going to combine these two and replace this with the center point over here, and then this cluster is identified. And mathematically, or if you were to look at in terms of graph, you got the first iteration, then you got the second iteration, and then you got the third iteration. And with that, we are able to actually find out these different clusters in multiple iterations. So you can perform these iterations parallelly, and then ideally construct this something called as the dendrogram. And the dendrogram kind of actually shows you where which point belongs. And at the end, we want to find out a cluster 1, and we want to find out cluster 2. And that is actually the unsupervised hierarchical clustering. And the MATLAB code that I showed you a moment ago, where we just ran without talking about the theory, is wherein what it does is basically it performs this clustering. Now the question is, we are trying to find out the distance. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at this distance? So what is this distance measure? And this distance measure, it could be the absolute distance, or it could be the Euclidean distance, or it could be the square Euclidean distance, or so on and so forth. So this distance can be anything. It could be Euclidean, Manhattan, maximum, Mahalanobis, and this distance again depends upon what you define in the algorithm, and you would be able to perform this hierarchical clustering. So now there are few more algorithms, which is a mixture model. Then you have the expectation maximization algorithm. Then you have supervised learning. And then what we are going to look at is we are going to look at the support vector machines. We are going to look at the different kernels for support vector machines. And then we are going to look at the decision trees. And then we are going to look at the random forest. So far, we have looked at what is supervised learning, what is unsupervised learning, and we looked at some algorithms corresponding to unsupervised learning. We will talk about the next algorithm, which is mixture model and expectation maximization algorithm. And then we will go on to the supervised learning, and we will actually, that will finish this chapter. So I'm going to stop here today and be happy to answer any questions you may have. Once again, I want to let you know that I have uploaded the homework, which are the end of chapter problems from chapter 4. Please note that there are not many problems. I think there are just 4 problems. Please complete those problems, and I have given you about a week to 10 days. So by next week, we'll finish this chapter, and then what I would do is I would actually assign the homework on this. So we'll finish chapter 5 in next class, and then we will move on to chapter 6 and 7. Any questions from anyone?